Right, if you would, returning to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. We're at a section here in chapter 5, verses 17 to 20. It's taken us a while. We've only gotten through a verse a week. Had that brought home to me today. I don't know if you saw, I was asked to do the devotion for the church this past week on Matthew 8. And they said, I said, well, what part of Matthew 8? And they said, no, Matthew 8. Yeah, that's exactly right. Exactly right. If you know me, and I said, well, how long do I have? They say, most people do 8 to 10 minutes. For an entire chapter?
Summarize. That's all we get to is read the chapter.
Okay, I did summarize. I did my best, 18 minutes. Okay, I set a new record for it. But it is what it is. Hopefully people will still watch it anyway.
Are you sure they didn't mean verse 8?
And I still might have done 18 minutes on that, to be quite honest with you. Well, we're going to try to finish this section today. We're going to really ramp it up. We're going to do 2 entire verses today. And yeah, I know, putting the pedal to the metal and really pushing ourselves to get through this. But we're trying to deal with this area where Jesus addresses the issue of the law. As we said in this sermon, this opening sermon, the first sermon of his ministry on earth, Jesus tries to lay out an understanding of who he is and what he has come to do. And one of the things he tries to address here in verses 17 to 20 is the issue of the law. The expectations that people have, their understanding of the law, what they've been taught about the law, and he's trying to let them understand it. And he's trying to put it into perspective, because if they do not understand what the purpose of the law is, they will not understand what he has come to do. Unless the law is in its right understanding, unless the law is in the right issue in your mind, unless you see what the law is intended to do, you cannot see what the Messiah has come to accomplish. So he's got to put this back in perspective, and that's what he's trying to do in this passage here. And beginning this, I'd like to look at a parallel passage, if you will, and I want you to turn over, if you would, today to Luke chapter 18. And there's a parable here that I think you're going to find very familiar. I doubt there's anyone in the room that hasn't gone through this at one time or another. But this is really a parallel passage where Jesus is getting after the same issue he's trying to get after here. An understanding of what the law does for you. And this is Luke chapter 18, starting in verse 9. And here it comes. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. Here's the parable you might remember of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And here is trying to drive something home, the same point we're trying to make here as we deal with this. So he says, 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. And the Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself, God, I thank you I am not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, and even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all that I get. Now, I want you to stop there. This is the Pharisee who's looking at himself. This is the Pharisee, and I think this is where Jesus is focusing. These were the people that thought they understood God's law. And their understanding of God's law is what drives this prayer. Now, we really go after the Pharisees, but I want you to stop and think for a minute and try to put yourself in his shoes and think about what he's saying here, because I don't think the Pharisee really sees himself as an arrogant fool in this moment. Yes?
Now, are they praying this out loud in front of an altar or something?
Now, that is an interesting thing. We are not told whether he's exactly doing that out loud or not. But it had become common in the time of Jesus for people to do that, specifically that you might be overheard praying, so that people would know just how righteous you were. So it is possible, very possible, that this is an outside, a verbal prayer. If it is not, if it's just going on in his heart or to himself, it is still the attitude and still the problem that's being addressed. But as you see the opening, to some who were confident of their own righteousness, very likely they see this, and they would immediately identify with the character here. And understand, they wouldn't have seen a problem when Jesus finishes his description. And I want you to see that in human terms, there's not a problem. Think about what the Pharisee is. Is he like other men? No, he's really not. There was an old Jewish proverb that said this: if only two people were to make it to heaven, they would be a Pharisee and a scribe. They were seen as the most righteous people of their day. If you were looking for someone that met every moral standard that we hold for the kind of people we would tend to admire, it would be a Pharisee. Great neighbor, a guy who does the right thing, a guy who tries very hard to be right before God. Now I want you to understand what this guy is saying. He's not like other men. First of all, the Pharisee recognized he had a gift in the law of God that the nations did not have. He was different in that he had something, he knew what God had said. They respected this gift. You know the meticulous efforts that were gone through to maintain the integrity of the Old Testament text, right? The things they did, when they copied and recopied to make sure they could keep it accurate, they would count every letter, and they would go back and recount a passage to make sure that everything was completely accurate. They appreciated. So one, he sees himself in this stature before God, able to pray unlike other men. He recognized that gift. And I thank you, I'm not like other men. And he starts talking about how evil some people are. Robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or worse yet, the lowest of the low, a thing that no one would want to stoop to, a tax collector. Now, I also want you to think of this. In his culture, he was right. He was looking at the worst form of crime and corruption you could possibly imagine. I mean, look what he's talking about, adulterers, evildoers. I mean, in his mind, a murderer would be better than a tax collector. And why was that? Why were these people seen at such a low level? Starting point, traitors. Understand this. We're in a time of Roman occupation, and Rome understood things. They needed people to collect their taxes for them. They didn't tend to send Romans into this. They looked for a local person to do it who would know who everyone was and where everyone lived to make sure that they got money from everyone. And so they had to find a local person willing to see to it that Rome could invade the life of every person in their district. So this is a Jew that is sold out to the Roman oppressor. As we said, I told you this before, the worst of it came to this. What was the enticement? How could Rome get someone to turn on their neighbors like that? To sell out the people they lived with, knowing he would be ostracized. What could possibly get a person to do that?
Monetary incentive.
Lots of money. And here's the deal. Here's the deal, as I've told you before. The deal was simply this. Rome said, we need this amount of taxes from this district. You can collect as much as you can get away with. And if you send us this much, you know what you get to do?
Keep it.
You keep the rest. Consequently, can you imagine the type of person that tended to be pulled to this position? I mean, generally it's the person that has the lowest moral character imaginable. A person that is willing, as I said, to sell out his neighbors, his friends, to ruin his reputation, to know he's going to be ostracized because he can get rich. And what's going to touch him? What can hurt him? Because he has the power of Rome behind him. It's legal. He can steal as much as he wants, and it's legal. How many people have the character to stand up to that kind of corruption, to say, you can do whatever you want, and it's legal? Now here's the contrast. But the tax collector stood at a distance. You know what he's saying here? Tax collector wouldn't even come into the place of worship. He didn't feel worthy to even walk on the soil close enough to where a Jew was supposed to gather to worship God. He stands at a distance. He wouldn't look up into heaven. Here's the other thing. What do we do when we pray?
Our
All
heads.
bow our head. You know what the Jews did? They tended to look up and they tended to do this. Why?
Look at me.
Well, that's one thing, but it also, think this, where in their minds was the place to look toward God. Look to the heavens, from whence comes my hope, okay, or the mountains. And it was always an up situation. For them, it was that idea. But he wouldn't look up. But he beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Here's the shocker. Everybody go, yeah, God will have to have him. What a horrible sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. You get this? What's the other guy saying? He makes sure he gives more than enough. He is fasting twice a week. That was more than the law demanded. We have a Pharisee who's not just a good Pharisee, he is an exceptional Pharisee. Doing more than is required because he wants to do right. He wants to be right with God. And you have a tax collector, and Jesus tells the Pharisees the only person leaving that day justified was the tax collector. Can you understand the shock to this? For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Now, coming back to our text. Why is this a parallel? Jump down to the last verse we're going to see here. For I tell you this, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the scribes, or the teachers of the law here, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven.
Where are you reading that? I'm sorry.
Back in our passage, Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, the last verse of the section we're dealing with.
Okay.
I want you to see that parallel. In both cases, Jesus is picking a comparative he wants you to make. And he's saying this, when it comes to salvation, when it comes to being right before God, the comparative you have to make is not between you and worse people than you. The comparative, he's saying, is you have to be better than the best person you know. The standard of God is higher than the best standard man has ever achieved. And why is he trying to make that the point of this passage? Because the law of God is the issue. What is the comparative you make? Is it between you and a tax collector? Is it between you and a murderer? Is it between you and some other kind of adulterer or sinner? What's the comparative you have to make to determine if you're right before God?
Comparison against God.
Against God. The standard of God. And where is the standard of God recorded? In the law and the Word of God. He is saying this, if you want to make heaven, you're going to have to be better than that. You're going to have to meet the standard of God. And here's what Jesus is trying to put out here. Who can meet that standard? No one can. It's an impossible standard. It can't be done through your power. You are missing the point of the law. The law was not there for you to measure how good you were compared to everybody else. Here's the law. I made it this high. You only made it this high. What's the law there to do? To establish that no matter what you do, what do you fall short of? The law. No matter how good, and as was read there from James, what does it say? If you transgress one portion of the law, what are you? You're a lawbreaker. It doesn't matter which law you break, you're a lawbreaker. And if you break one law, what is the standard that God is going to say? You are guilty of the law. This is where Jesus starts this point. This is what he's trying to bring home here, and he's going to try to go through this. He's trying to remind them of the importance of the law, or they won't understand why they need a Savior. This is what Israel had lost. This is what they had lost sight of. They no longer understood what the Messiah was coming to do, what he was going to accomplish. And unless Jesus can push them back to understanding why the law is unchanged, why the law has to be understood from God as it has always been understood, they will not understand what he is about to do. They will miss the entire point of the cross. They will miss the point of the resurrection. And the bulk of the Jews did exactly that. They missed the point. So here's how Jesus brings that. Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. And I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. This is where he wants to bring them. As we've said, this crowd has gathered with an expectation. And I want you to understand that expectation as much as we can. We usually stop with this. What did they come to hear, and what did they expect from the Messiah? Political freedom. A political revolution, an end to Roman occupation, an end to the ignominy of generations of being under other powers. They wanted something to change. But I also want you to understand this. That wasn't the only thing on their minds. That was certainly there in Israel. But there was also this. There was a frustration and an emptiness that had been growing for generations. The law, as we told you, had no longer been defined as the thing that God had written in the Ten Commandments or even the Old Testament. It was now that meticulous set of rules that the scribes and Pharisees and the Sadducees had developed over generations into this huge list of do's and don'ts. The law was divided into two parts: the positive statements of God and the negative. And guess which was the longer list?
Negative.
The negative, by a long shot, more than double the length in terms of the laws they dealt with. And it was frustrating because I want to put you in this position. Most of us do not get to do what the scribes and Pharisees, and that is to spend their lives digging into Scripture. You know why? Because like us, you had to eat. You had to work for a living. Now try this. Imagine that you're being told that the way to please God is this massive and involved, super meticulous, very complicated list of rules that you never have the time to memorize and understand. But that's the standard by a group of guys who don't have to live like you do, who don't have to deal with your kind of challenges in life, and are telling you, here's the standard. What's that going to do for you? You're going to feel a little, it's depressing. I can never understand it well enough to get it right. Understand, remember the young man that came to Jesus and said, can you sum up, what's the most important rule in the law? Do you understand what he's really asking? Can we trim this down? Can we get the condensed version of this? Can we get down to what really matters here and understand this? Because I can't do that. And he's asking Jesus, how does it really sum up? If I'm really going to get right with God, because I want you to understand this as well. Israel had an emptiness because they knew there was something missing. They knew they were supposed to be right with God. They knew they were the chosen people, and they did not have a sense of that relationship anymore because they had lost sight of what the law was there to do, and that was to tell them that grace was the only means of being made right with God. And they had lost that sense, and they wanted that to be put there. So they've come here with several things. One, we'd like to have a political change. Let's make sure that we get this right. And two, can we get a religion we can understand and actually do so that we can get right with God? So their hope was that Jesus would come in and give a simpler faith. Could he give a better and shorter list of rules? And Jesus hits them with this. And I want you to understand the shock in this when he tells them, I'm not changing any of the rules. Because in their mind, they're now thinking, oh my gosh, we got to go back to this huge list from the Pharisees again. How are we going to do this? And Jesus is going to try here to push them into understanding what they've missed is the real law, an impossible standard, a standard that I need to bring you back to make you understand what I'm about to tell you and what I'm about to do. And he makes this statement, I have not come to abolish it, but to fulfill it. Now, I want you to remember what we said about that, fulfilling. No law that God made, he goes, you know what, that one didn't work out. Let's just cast that aside and try something else, shall we? He's not like our Congress. That they pass a law, find out that didn't work, pretend they didn't make a mistake, and pass another law and make more and more and more and more laws. That is not how this is going to work here. That is not how it's supposed to work here. He says that the law of God is given, it's perfect, but some laws fulfill and finish their purpose to fulfill it. And this is the one we want to start with. How did we make that determination? What do you look at? If you're going to look at the scripture and you're going to say, some of these things we no longer do in the New Testament, how do you make that determination? And I gave you, I hope, a simple rule last week for doing that. You take and look at any law that says this is what you're supposed to do, and you measure that against the completed work of Christ, and you ask this question. If I observe this law, am I in any way detracting from or diminishing what Jesus did? And that is the beginning point. Why don't we sacrifice animals anymore?
Christ was once and for all.
Once and for all. To say that is to say his sacrifice was not sufficient. Any rule that does that. Why do we not travel to a location to find God on his special throne? Because that's not where he dwells anymore. We have been told that things have changed. Remember when Jesus spoke to the Samaritan woman and said, there's going to come a time you don't have to go to the temple, you don't have to go to your place of worship to find God. That's not going to be necessary anymore. These things changed. However, if you find any law, any commandment that deals with a character that you are to display that would bring honor to God and display His character before a watching world, what do you do with that law?
Keep it.
You keep it. Because it's going to make you better?
Sort of.
Sort of.
It's going to give God glory.
But there's the biggest issue, because it's going to bring God glory. We look at this and it seems so patently obvious to us, but isn't that the biggest struggle we really have in religion, in our faith? Isn't it the hardest thing in the world to really practice that, even in your own life, knowing the theology, to understand that you really can't buy a better relationship with God, you really can't do something to earn more credit with Him? Isn't that the biggest struggle? In all honesty, and I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, have any of you ever struggled with a moment in prayer where you've gone before God and you try to cut a deal? I really need this. I want this for my child. I want this in my marriage. And God, if I will, and you start saying, here's what I'll do. It is hard to get away from that, isn't it? To understand that God cannot be bribed. Even in Christian faith, look at all of the things that we bring into this. The churches that claim to be Christian. Among many charismatic churches is this idea that, yes, we are saved by grace, but if you can be a more spiritual Christian, you can get a second blessing, a greater dose, more of God than anyone else gets. And we have this sense that we can earn something from God. That's where we have this whole thing of purgatory in the Catholic Church. Even growing up in Southern Baptist churches, we wound up with lists of things that would tell us how much better a Christian we could be. In my growing up, there was probably no greater sin than dancing. It was the worst thing you could do. It was just awful to see that. The character issues, smoking, really bad things. You just things, and these became the rules and issues that differentiated us from the rest of the world.
Myron?
Yes.
But when you talk about the character of the people in this time period, it doesn't differ too much from where we are today.
Not at all.
Which leads you to believe that the fake or the Antichrist comes in pretending to be the Savior, and those people are going to be so easily swayed because it's meeting what they feel is the need for a Savior, and not the truth, not that narrow path. They're taking that wide path, and it's going to be like hooray for them.
To show how much it has not changed, how many cults have still come along with a claim to be the Savior now that people buy.
Exactly.
That's another coming of Christ. It is amazing
Radio
what we
shows
buy
on.
into.
There's radio programs saying that they know the time and the day and the this and the that. It's just crazy.
The insanity of it is the human condition of sin. And this is what Jesus is pointing at. And it has not changed. That is why the Bible is pertinent to us again and again. It comes down to this. So with that understanding then, Jesus starts by telling him two things. One, he needs to know the preeminence of the law. That's where he says the law does not change. This is where we have to understand that what God said does not change, is not alterable, is always true. The second thing he put is the permanence of it. And that's where he says not one stroke of the pen does God cast out, does God change his mind, does God go to plan B. That is it. But now, what's the pertinence of it? If we know it is preeminent and we know that it's permanent, what do I do with it? And now is where Jesus in the next couple of verses is trying to address that and talk to us about what it's supposed to do in our lives. Now let's look at verse 19, where we left off, and pick this up. Anyone who breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. All right. Shelby, last week you asked me, are there levels of heaven? This is one of the verses people will point to say, yes, there are. And they will say that clearly right now what we're establishing here is that if you do better with the law, you will get a better place in heaven. However, We know that Jesus has already been pointing out that it's not an issue of earning your way up, so that can't be the interpretation, especially from the parable we just read. Because the guy that was doing it all right isn't even going to make it into heaven, whereas the guy that was doing it all wrong on that day will. So what is he talking about here? Let's deal with that issue of whether or not there are levels and so forth of heaven. Do I believe that God is going to hand out differing levels of rewards on the judgment day at the Bema Seat? Yeah, you know why I know that? He says so. He lays it out. There's going to be passing out the crowns and the recognition of things. But we also established that. At the end of that point, what do those people do with those crowns they've been granted? Lay them at the feet of Jesus, saying, you did it. Without you, it wouldn't have happened. That's the thing. Do I believe that in heaven there might be recognition among us that some people, I have a feeling I'm still going to hold Paul in awe. I'm pretty sure I'm going to see that guy as a little different than most people I've ever read about, met, or so. I think I'm going to see him as different. Do I believe that at the end of the day he's going to go up to the level 9 and I'm not getting to see him unless he wants to come down and... No. These distinctions don't hold there. I would put this out. The thief on the cross. How much time did he have to do any good things?
No, not much. 10 seconds?
Yeah, about 10 seconds. That's sort of a limited thing. So what? He gets to hang out at the gate and kind of look inside? There must be something else going on here in terms of what Jesus is talking about and what he's addressing. And I think it all comes down to this of saying the truth of what it is and what you're trying to accomplish. Anyone who breaks the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. What is it the Pharisees were doing? The Pharisees were talking about how righteous they were, but they were breaking critical rules. How are we going to find that out? Because starting in verse 21, Jesus is going to point out, what did they miss in all this discussion? With all of their rules, with this huge list of do's and don'ts, the evil things that you can't do, the good things that you must do, what is it they missed time and time again?
The attitude toward it.
The attitude, what the issue of the heart. What am I? Jesus is much more concerned with what you are. Is there any better example of that than David? I mean, let's stop and think about David's life for a minute. In your mind, if you're very honest and you think about what David did, is this an admirable man?
No.
I'm sorry. Well, his general, his good friend, is gone. He sees his wife and has relations with her. And then the guy comes back. He tries to trick him in so he doesn't find out what's going on. He needs to have him go in and spend time with Bathsheba because he knows there's going to be a child and the truth's going to come out. And that doesn't work because the guy is more honorable. He gets him drunk, remember? Gets the guy drunk, and the guy is more honorable drunk than David was sober. Mm-hmm. And finally, what does he do? He has him murdered. He plots his death. And yet, what is the assessment that God says about David? Heart. Because David recognized his sin, as the tax collector did. And this is what we're dealing with here. The pertinence of the law comes down to this, that we are dedicated to the truth of God, not because we think it's earning us something, but because we know that the character of it will transform us into the kind of people we are supposed to be. I also want to put this verse out to you. I've taken some flack for this in the past, and I understand that I've come off real hard on this one, and I've made this statement more than once. If you don't want to take the time to get the text right, do me a favor and don't say anything about the text. I've also put it as strongly as this. If you're going to get up and preach your parables and your personal stuff and you're not going to tell me what's in the text, please sit down and shut up. I'd rather deal with silence than that.
So is that verse 19?
That's verse 19 so far. I'll put this out to you because Herod, who breaks the least of these commandments and does what? Teaches others to do the same. If you're going to mess with the text, if you're not going to take the time to get it right, there is a guilt attached to this. There's a reason I have such a strong view on this. He's making this plain because it isn't just that you're messing your life up. You're damaging the lives of other people. There's a problem here that we have to deal with. Get it right. Understand it and apply it. And put it down the way it's supposed to be. The Pharisees were teaching generations of people not to understand what God really said. And do most churches do exactly that, quite frankly, today? Yeah, John?
Question here, because he talks about, and teaches people that will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. So it sounds like this is somebody who is saved and is going to be in the kingdom. But if you're talking about like Pharisees and Sadducees, and they were clearly not saved.
They were clearly not saved.
They were teaching people to do, and elsewhere where he talks about false
That is the
teachers.
divide. You're right. There's the divide and there's the distinction. There's two complete, and I'm going to share that with you. I'm glad you asked the question because I had to get there. Who's he talking to? Who is he talking here to? Well, he's talking to the crowd, but as we start this, if you go back to thing, now when he saw the crowds, he went up the mountainside and he sat down, and his disciples came to him and he began to teach them. So our context is that he starts talking to disciples and lets the crowd listen in. And yet we have this issue here that seems to say he's talking about the Pharisees, because he's going to say in verse 20, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." Two theological thoughts. We'll let you decide between the two and let you see what you think. Then I'll tell you what I think. First theological thought is this, that Jesus is speaking to a Jewish crowd and he's saying this: you've missed this forever. And unless you do something, unless you guys change from how you're understanding the law now, unless you move beyond what the scribes and Pharisees have been teaching in Israel for generations, this generation is not going to find salvation. The Savior has arrived and you're going to miss him. And that's the warning he's issuing right here. That's what he's putting out. And he's warning these Jews that you, who see yourself as members of the kingdom of heaven, you're the chosen people, you've been waiting for the Messiah for generations. It's arrived and you are going to be excluded. And he says that's what it means by being the least. You're going to be cast out. Yes, Shelby?
Well, weren't you just talking about how some people will probably be born results and they'll get the crowns and it'll be like a nice thing, and then they're going to put the crowns at the feet of God and be like, it was you, and it'll be like the whole thing. So, well, what if is it talking about that kind of situation? Because again, it says called, and I don't know what it says in other versions of the Bible, but it will be called least in the kingdom of heaven.
Called least, yes.
So in other words, you're still there, you're just not getting a crown.
Hold on to that one, because here's the other theological approach to this. That one is one. Now, we have any takers that want to go with that? Because that is a number of top theologians feel that that's what's being addressed here. The issue of Israel, that they are in the kingdom at this point and they're about to squander it all away. The other view is that he's speaking to his disciples and he's talking to those who are in the kingdom and he's saying this: I'm giving you a warning. Salvation is there. But there's more to this than just getting saved. There is doing it right. And you have to get serious about this. I would put this out. Can you think of any stories in Scripture where God dealt very harshly with believers?
Job.
Okay. Try a New Testament one. Ananias and Sapphira. Do we find anything that indicates that they lost their salvation? What did they lose? Their lives. Sounds pretty harsh. 1 Corinthians has an interesting story that says that you guys are doing things so badly that some of you are sick and some of you have fallen asleep. You know what he's saying there? Died. God has said your testimony is such a problem, we better call you home now rather than let you continue to be this much of an issue. But their salvation wasn't on the line. Paul, I love Paul, who's saying, the last thing I want after having run this race of my life, having pursued to do everything right before God, to have been found lacking and to be disqualified at the end. Disqualified from salvation? Is that what Paul was saying? Do you think Paul was rather definitive about the whole salvation lasting thing? You might want to look at Romans. We just had a mention of that, Romans chapter 8, the greatest chapter in the Bible. Yes, Paul makes it rather plain that salvation is a set deal. What was Paul worried about? The quality of life, being less than he was supposed to be for Christ. The warning here might well be this. You can be a Christian who's more problem than help. You can be the kind of person that we look to in any church that people look to and say, that's why I don't go to church. And the salvation may be yours. But the challenge here is, come back to the issue of character. Because salvation is not based on meeting the law, but your testimony is based on how you deal with the moral law of God. How well you lay this out, what you do with this, how you impact people to earn the recognition of being someone who stands for God. Those are the two approaches to this, and I'll tell you where I come down on this. I tend to think he's talking to believers because he starts this chapter by saying he talked to his disciples. I tend to think he's looking at believers and he's putting a challenge out to tell us this. Don't let the whole idea that you're going to learn here about grace rob you of the fact that there still is striving to do what's right to honor God. To some Christians, you ever run into Christians that have that sense? I've dealt with some that's fire insurance, that they never have to worry about it. There's a laxness. Paul even challenges it. Should I sin all the more that grace may abound? Remember that comment?
Yes.
And of course, Paul says, absolutely, that's exactly what I'm going to do.
No.
Now, it doesn't quite work out that way. Well, let's throw that one out. It's absurd. It's absurd. But he understands the mindset that can come here. What is the purpose of the law then? To set a standard for a believer's life to be honoring to God. Why is it unchanging? Because the standard of character has never changed. And I would ask you this. Every time we see someone come along to challenge our faith, what is it they always want to change and alter? And that is the issue of what establishes character and what is true. No one has a problem with a list of rules. You know, all faiths have a list of rules. Rules are easy to deal with. But when we want to define character, because when we define character, you know what we wind up doing? Finding out how guilty we are. The second we go to what is it I am inside, that gets to be a problem. We like faith that leaves it on the outside.
We don't want truth. People don't want to hear truth. And that separates us from the believer and the unbeliever because they want to dictate to God what they feel is true versus what he says is true about like, the character that you are or you aren't.
Always. That's why we want to call sin and make it the new standard for morality.
Right.
Because we want to come back to this idea of justifying ourselves in terms of conduct. In terms of conduct. And we're watching that change in our world right now. What Jesus is setting that up for here as he comes to verse 20, for I tell that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. He's setting them up for this understanding that you have to come to grace. You're missing the point of the Old Testament. You have lost what God tried to establish all along. That you aren't ever going to be good enough, and that's the point. If the law ceases to teach you that, it has ceased to do its job. The law was never there to establish how good you are. It was always there to establish guilt. And in establishing guilt, we establish the need for a Savior. If you can't achieve this, what's the only hope you have? I mean, if it comes down to that, if you have a debt that you can never work off, you need to find a benefactor who has the means to pay it. And he is saying the only one who has that kind of resources available is God. And that's why he's going to come down this. You have heard it said, and he's going to start to contrast what they think with what God has always laid out in terms of character of a person. Now, this was a complicated one, and I hope you bore with me as we got through this, trying to compare and understand what's going on here. But Jesus has to get their theology back to the right beginning point. Where do I stand before God, and what is the law telling me about myself? And unless you can answer that question, you're not going to be prepared to answer the next question, will you accept him as Lord and Savior? And these people are not going to be prepared for that. So close that, and then